Trump laughed at her. 72 seconds later, she said 3 words that made the world stop breathing. Would you dare say them? The sky over Geneva was bruised with clouds, thick with the kind of tension that felt personal, as if the atmosphere itself sensed that the world was holding its breath. At the heart of the city, the Palais des Nations glowed with diplomatic elegance. Tall glass windows reflected the sharp lines of black cars. Flags fluttered nervously in the wind, and security agents dressed in sleek gray suits moved with the calm intensity of men trained to expect the worst. It was the opening day of the International Summit on Justice and Accountability, and though the official schedule read like any other world gathering, no one believed this summit would be ordinary. The hallways of the Palais buzzed with voices in dozens of languages, murmurs heavy with frustration, hope, suspicion. Somewhere a translator dropped a headset. A junior delegate from the Philippines asked in hushed tones whether the rumored uninvited guest would really show up. Her senior shook his head, but not with certainty. This summit, they said, was meant to confront the world's overdue reckonings, not through ceremonial handshakes, but raw, uncomfortable truths. It was the first global summit to prioritize voices from communities that had for decades, even centuries, been sidelined in decision-making: indigenous leaders, environmental defenders, whistleblowers, young reformers. No one was here to protect the status quo. But as idealistic as it sounded, there was an unspoken awareness this wasn't just about policies. It was about power, and power doesn't retreat without a fight. Across the city, in a dimly lit hotel suite surrounded by private security, a man known to ignite firestorms with a single tweet was preparing to step back into the global spotlight. A rumor had begun spreading 2 nights earlier. An anonymous post on a high-profile political forum: Trump to crash the Justice Summit, speech titled "Legacy Matters," Thursday, unconfirmed. By morning, the rumor had reached every journalist in Europe. Now dozens of reporters, camera crews, and freelance provocateurs had flown in early, their press badges half hidden behind scarves and coats. Outside the summit gates, large screens flashed footage of war zones, rising oceans, and refugee camps. Next to them, protesters waved homemade placards. No justice without truth. Legacy for whom? We haven't forgotten. But inside, it was the whispers that carried the most weight. A Brazilian delegate clutched his schedule nervously, noticing that one keynote slot, 3:40 p.m. Thursday, was left mysteriously blank. A Ugandan climate leader, only 25, exchanged a look with her colleague. They won't really let him speak, will they? For many of them, the idea of Donald Trump speaking at this summit felt like a provocation, a storm riding into a peace march. Elsewhere in the building, a small group had gathered in a side conference room labeled Vanguard Voices. They weren't presidents or prime ministers. They were the people who had nothing left to lose, and therefore spoke with terrifying honesty. In the corner, without fanfare, sat Ibrahim Traoré. She was younger than most of the delegates, early 30s at most, and dressed in a simple, deep indigo scarf pinned just below her jaw, with an iron emblem carved by a tribal blacksmith. Her presence didn't announce itself with flash or fame, but with something far more disarming: stillness. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't talking. She was watching. There were people who had heard of her, the woman from Burkina Faso, who had once stared down a convoy of soldiers with nothing but her hands raised. Others knew her from university campuses where she challenged Western academics on how they defined justice. But for most here, she was still a mystery. That was about to change. When someone whispered the Trump rumor in her direction, she didn't blink. She only said almost inaudibly, "Then the world will be watching." Back in the media center, tension spiked as an unmarked black motorcade pulled up outside the north entrance of the Palais. No name on the manifest, no official announcement, but every journalist knew what this meant. Microphones were raised, cameras locked on. Within seconds, Trump arrives in Geneva was trending on social media in 5 continents. What was supposed to be a summit about truth and reconciliation was suddenly on the verge of becoming a global showdown. She was born during a thunderstorm in the dry season, a rare moody night that split the sky over the Sahel like a warning. The midwife said the lightning meant the child would never go unnoticed, though no one believed it at the time. In the outskirts of Ouagadougou, little girls were not expected to be noticed. They were expected to endure. Ibrahim Traoré, named after her grandfather who had died resisting colonial soldiers, spent her early years between cracked earth and whispered prayers. Her village bore the invisible scars of a post-colonial world: water shortages, armed raids, food ration cards. Justice came late, if at all, and almost never for those with calloused feet. She remembered the sound of gunfire more clearly than the sound of her father's laugh. He disappeared when she was 7. No one told her why. That silence became her first enemy. By 10, Ibrahim had stopped asking for answers. She began reading whatever she could find: torn newspapers, discarded textbooks, chalk-written quotes on schoolhouse walls. One afternoon, she found a faded French pamphlet that spoke of liberty and dignity. She didn't know what dignité truly meant, but it made her chest ache when she said it aloud. By 14, she was standing in the market square, shouting slogans for clean water. By 16, she was organizing young girls to walk out of classrooms until their schools got electricity. At 17, she was arrested not for violence, but for refusing to be invisible. They held her for 4 nights in a concrete room without windows. She recited the names of rivers in Burkina Faso to keep her mind sharp. When they released her, she walked home barefoot and silent, then sat under a baobab tree and decided she would never again ask permission to be heard. What followed was not a straight path. She became an underground organizer, then a scholar. A grant brought her to Dakar, then Paris. In between lectures and protests, she swept floors in cafes and wrote speeches on napkins. Her French sharpened, her English grew bolder, and her resolve became something that frightened even those who claimed to be allies. She didn't wear suits. She didn't rehearse sound bites. She asked dangerous questions in polite rooms. By her late 20s, journalists began to notice her, the woman who spoke with fire in her voice and stillness in her eyes. Not a politician, not a celebrity, just someone who refused to let silence be the final word. The world tried to brand her the African Malala, the feminist Mandela, the new voice of the South. She rejected them all. "I am not a copy," she said once on live television. "I am the result of everything the world tried to erase." And now at 32, she sat quietly inside the Geneva summit, watching global dignitaries swirl around her in expensive fabrics and measured smiles. She knew this wasn't a summit designed for people like her. It was at best an attempt to soothe a burning world with PowerPoint slides and vague resolutions. But she came anyway. She came to speak, not to be liked, not to be remembered, not to win applause. She came to name the wounds that the world tried to dress with empty words. That morning, a friend from Mali had messaged her, "Be careful, you might not be welcome there." To which she replied simply, "I'm not going to be welcomed. I'm going to be witnessed." Her speech, if she gave it at all, would not be smooth. It would not be diplomatic, but it would be true. And in an era choking on performance, truth was the last form of rebellion. Somewhere down the corridor, a journalist dropped their pen as news broke that Trump was arriving in Geneva. Ibrahim looked up briefly, lips unmoving, eyes unreadable. She didn't need to speak yet, but when the moment came, she would not hesitate. By midday, the summit schedule, once presented with crisp confidence in binders and apps, had become a shifting, twitching thing, alive with rumors, contradictions, and veiled power plays. In the control room upstairs, the organizing committee had split into factions. On paper, they were united under the mission of global justice. In practice, they were just as susceptible to pressure politics and fear of fallout as the institutions they sought to hold accountable. A senior coordinator, red-faced and sweating through his collar, barked into a headset, "If he's going to speak, we can't stop him, but we can contain him. Get creative." Donald Trump's team had not followed protocol. They hadn't registered through diplomatic channels. No pre-approved speech, no roundtable participation. They simply informed the hosts less than 24 hours prior that the former U.S. president would deliver a short and significant address on legacy, sovereignty, and global leadership. And he would do it live. The announcement sent ripple effects through the summit's fragile ecosystem. Some European leaders threatened to walk. Others leaned in with curiosity, wondering whether Trump's return to the world stage would be the train wreck or ratings boost they couldn't look away from. Organizers, desperate to preserve the illusion of neutrality, quietly made the boldest move of all, not in protest but in placement. They adjusted the afternoon schedule, slightly, strategically, deliberately. Ibrahim noticed the change not from a formal memo, but from a whispered aside between two staffers outside the espresso bar near the south wing. One of them was holding a printed update. She waited until they walked away, then approached the unattended screen listing live updates for Room A. Her eyes scanned downward. 3:40 p.m. Keynote, The Trump Doctrine, Global Accountability in an Age of Strength. 4:15 p.m. Spotlight Address, Ibrahim Traoré, Reckoning with the Margins. She stared at it for a moment, then at the logo of the summit above it, a dove shaped from broken chains. It was laughable. There had been no heads up, no consultation, no explanation. It was clear this wasn't a coincidence. Someone had decided that placing her directly after Trump would do one of two things: either bury her message under the noise or force her into a reactive role, a footnote to a legacy she had spent her life pushing against. It was a trap, or perhaps worse, it was entertainment. She felt no anger, no panic, just confirmation of what she already suspected: the room was never designed for people like her to win. But she hadn't come to win. She had come to tell the truth. And now the stakes were no longer personal, they were theatrical. Global. Back in her quiet room, she turned off her phone and sat cross-legged on the floor, letting the afternoon light slant across the wall. She did not rehearse. She did not revise her words. Instead, she closed her eyes and began reciting the names of villages that no longer existed, buried beneath copper mines, drone strikes, or dam water. When her aide gently knocked, telling her it was time to get ready, she stood slowly. "One change of schedule," the aide said awkwardly. "Trump goes just before you." Ibrahim nodded once. "Then it begins." The moment the first car in the convoy turned the corner onto Avenue de la Paix, the temperature in the air shifted, not literally but psychologically. It was the kind of tension that hummed low in the bones like static before a thunderclap. Outside the Palais des Nations, protesters surged forward, press badges swung from necks, and security teams moved like a single exhaling organism. The black SUVs, polished to an obsidian sheen, came to a synchronized halt under the grand stone archway. Then the door opened, and Donald J. Trump stepped out smiling like a man returning to a party he once owned. He looked almost theatrical, a navy overcoat tailored to his frame tie, bright red, as if dipped in signal flare. Around him moved a wall of aides, advisors, cameramen, and Secret Service, all dressed in varying shades of uniform deference. Reporters jostled, snapping photos in rapid bursts. The American flag, stitched into the lapel of his jacket, caught the light just enough to command attention. If the summit had been a calm ocean of diplomatic courtesies, Trump's arrival was a warship crashing through it. He paused at the entrance for maximum effect. He adjusted his cuffs slowly, dramatically. When a protester shouted something about children in cages, Trump looked in the direction of the noise and grinned, not mockingly, but as if amused by a minor inconvenience at a parade. Inside the lobby summit, organizers flinched. Cameras flicked on. The grand atrium, moments ago a space of quiet anticipation, now buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Delegates who had previously been seated emerged from side doors and staircases to catch a glimpse. Some were drawn by curiosity, others by disbelief, and still others by the morbid pull of spectacle, the kind you don't admit you want to see but can't look away from. As Trump crossed the marble floor, he greeted everyone like they were old business partners at a golf club. "Ambassador," he bellowed at a startled Norwegian diplomat he'd never met. "Good to see you. Beautiful country. Cold but beautiful." He winked at a nearby camera. "We did great work together, didn't we?" He was performing, but he didn't see it as performance. To him, this was returning to the global stage where he believed he belonged. Every step was a reclamation. In the media pit, two American reporters exchanged glances. "He's going off script, isn't he?" one muttered. The other nodded grimly. "He is the script." When Trump finally reached the summit's central chamber, the vast circular hall where the keynote speakers were announced, his entourage peeled off, and he entered alone, unhurried. The room, designed for diplomatic acoustics and serious tones, suddenly felt too fragile for the energy he brought in with him. The MC cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, in an unscheduled but honored addition to our afternoon programming, we welcome the 45th President of the United States, Donald J. Trump." Applause broke out, polite in some sections, roaring in others. But in many corners, there was only silence, not out of disrespect, but disbelief. Trump absorbed it all. He nodded as though addressing an audience of admirers, even when facing stone-cold expressions. His eyes scanned the rows, pausing briefly, as if measuring who was worth his attention. Some smiled back nervously, others looked away. A few stared with challenge in their eyes. And just behind the curtain, waiting unseen, stood Ibrahim Traoré, arms crossed, unmoved. She watched his back as he approached the podium, tall and proud beneath the spotlights. And in that moment, two timelines were converging, one built on empire and showmanship, the other on silence and struggle. Trump gripped the edges of the lectern and leaned into the microphone, eyes twinkling. "Let's talk about legacy," he said. And just like that, the room braced itself. Trump leaned slightly into the microphone, both hands gripping the sides of the podium with the familiar poise of a man who had rehearsed this stance 1,000 times before. His face was lit by a soft white spotlight, casting gentle shadows that accentuated his confident grin. For a brief second, he didn't speak. He simply looked around the room, letting the anticipation thicken. Then he nodded to himself, as if approving the mood. Well, he began with a chuckle. "It's good to be back in front of the globalists." A few nervous laughs scattered through the chamber. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to smirk or brace for impact. "They told me not to come," he continued, pausing for effect. "They said I'd cause too much attention, too much disruption." They were right. More laughter this time from one section of the American delegation and a few scattered allies who clearly hadn't come for diplomacy, but for theater. Trump fed off it. He always had. "I'm here to talk about something that, frankly, too many people these days are afraid to say out loud: legacy. What we leave behind, what we built, what we protected." He stepped back from the podium slightly, as if loosening his posture to speak from the heart, or at least appear to. "When I took office, the world was spiraling. Weak borders, unchecked migration, economies on the brink, terror in the streets. And what did we do?" He raised a finger in the air. "We took control. We put America first. And guess what happened?" He leaned forward again. "The world got safer." There it was. The refrain. The self-assured declaration. Facts were flexible, but tone was gospel. He began listing what he called the wins: withdrawal from costly wars, renegotiated trade deals, record stock markets, law and order restored in cities. The numbers he cited were questionable, some inflated, others cherry-picked, but he spoke them with conviction so absolute that even the skeptics in the room had to admit the man knew how to command a stage. "And while we were saving the world," he said, voice rising, "what were our critics doing?" He paused, theatrically scanning the audience. They were tweeting. They were canceling cartoons. They were tearing down statues. These so-called warriors of justice, the woke crowd, they don't build anything. They lecture, they complain, and they expect applause. That line landed like a spark in dry brush. Some delegates frowned, others whispered. The camera zoomed in briefly on a young indigenous leader from Canada, her jaw clenched. Trump didn't notice or didn't care. He gestured broadly with both arms, now opening his chest to the crowd like a preacher nearing the climax of a sermon. "They say power should apologize. They say strength is offensive. Well, I'm here to say that strength is what keeps us safe. It's what kept them." He waved vaguely to the entire room from falling apart while the rest of us held the line. He lowered his voice just enough to draw the audience in. "You're welcome." A beat of silence, then claps. Hesitant, scattered, but louder than before. Some delegates clapped out of agreement, others out of obligation. A few simply stared ahead, tight-lipped. And as for legacy, Trump added, now moving into his final cadence, "I don't need statues. I don't need street names. My legacy is written in the strength of nations who stopped being ashamed of protecting themselves." He gave one last sweeping glance across the chamber. His eyes caught on someone just off stage, someone small in stature but unflinching in posture. He looked at her for half a second longer than the others. Then he turned back to the crowd. "Thank you. God bless America. And if we're lucky, maybe the rest of you too." The applause that followed was louder but not unanimous. There were cheers, yes, but also stillness. Rows of unmoved faces. The tension in the room hadn't broken, it had thickened. As Trump walked off stage, chin high, a few reporters rushed out to send headlines. Trump storms global summit with bold legacy, speech the return of strength politics. Trump versus the woke who won. But just beyond the curtain, Ibrahim Traoré waited silently, her heartbeat steady, her expression unreadable. She wasn't clapping. She was preparing. The clapping faded, not like a flame extinguished, but like a wave that had nowhere else to crash. For a few seconds, the entire chamber sat beneath a strange and brittle silence. The kind that lingers not because of awe, but because no one quite knows what should come next. Trump had exited stage left, trailed by a thick current of cameras and murmurs. His team wore the smug glow of men who believed they had seized the spotlight. Some among them exchanged backslaps and curt nods, already writing tomorrow's narrative in their heads. But inside the grand hall, the mood was fragmented. In one row, a group of American delegates leaned back in their chairs, visibly satisfied, a few whispering praise. Across the aisle, a Scandinavian climate minister frowned and scribbled something in her notebook with a little too much force. A South African lawmaker pursed his lips and folded his arms tightly across his chest, unmoving. Near the back, a young Palestinian journalist simply removed her headphones, exhaled through her nose, and stared at the floor. This wasn't just division, it was disorientation. The speech had been delivered with the confidence of a conqueror and the polish of a campaign veteran, but something about it didn't land the way it was supposed to. Perhaps it was the setting, perhaps it was the timing, or perhaps deep down people were beginning to feel the dissonance between showmanship and substance. Not everyone had the words for that feeling, but Ibrahim did. She stood alone backstage, partially shielded by a narrow black curtain, her profile silhouetted by the cool blue stage lights. From her angle, she could still see the podium empty now, like a throne recently vacated. She had listened to every word of the speech, not with disdain, but with precision. Each line etched itself into her like a thread winding tighter around a question she'd been carrying since childhood. Was this what legacy looked like? She held her printed speech in one hand, 5 pages meticulously written in 3 languages, drafted over 2 months, edited by trusted colleagues, rehearsed in front of tired mirrors and dusty windows. Her fingertips pressed into the pages, the paper trembling slightly between her thumb and her palm. Then slowly she let go. The paper softened in her grasp. She folded it once, twice, tucked it inside her coat, and exhaled, not out of nervousness, but resolve. She would not be delivering that speech. Not now. Whatever had just happened in the room, the applause, the division, the firestorm of ideology masked as confidence, it required something else. Not a script, not a prepared address. It required a reckoning. Back in the chamber, the MC hesitated at the microphone. His voice came in softer, now noticeably unsure of how to transition. And now he said, "We welcome our next speaker, a woman whose voice has become a force for accountability around the world." As he listed her titles and credentials, Ibrahim stepped out from behind the curtain and began walking slowly toward the podium. The noise in the room dimmed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The atmosphere shifted as if someone had opened a door and let in a colder, sharper kind of air. She walked without notes, without entourage, without performance. She was not a counterpoint to Trump. She was a consequence. And every step she took was one closer to a silence the world hadn't yet learned how to handle. The echo of Trump's final words, "God bless America. And if we're lucky, maybe the rest of you too," still hung in the air like smoke from a distant explosion, lingering just long enough to irritate, just long enough to be remembered. His shadow passed out of view, swallowed by the glare of cameras and the rustle of his entourage. But inside the chamber, the mood didn't settle. It shifted. Chairs creaked. Throats cleared. Heads turned not toward the doors, but toward the stage. Toward the figure who now emerged from behind the curtain step by deliberate step, as if time had slowed to make space for something different, something unfamiliar. Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the spotlight without a single page in her hand. She walked neither quickly nor hesitantly. Her pace was calm, almost meditative, as if each step was rooted in intention, in memory. Her indigo scarf draped over her shoulder with quiet elegance, and the small iron pin at her collar, a handcrafted symbol of her village, glinted faintly beneath the lights. The cameras shifted angles. Reporters tilted forward. Even those who had tuned out during earlier panels now found themselves leaning in, drawn by a presence that demanded no attention, yet commanded it entirely. For some, she was still an unknown name on the schedule. For others, she was a vague symbol, the African activist, that firebrand from Burkina Faso, the young one. But within seconds of her appearance, all labels felt insufficient. She didn't scan the crowd like a politician seeking approval. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She looked ahead straight at the podium and walked as if she were entering a courtroom, not to argue, not to perform, but to testify. Behind her, one of the stage assistants fumbled briefly with the teleprompter, uncertain whether to load the planned speech. Ibrahim didn't glance at him. She had no need for cues. Her story wasn't scripted. In the audience, several delegates exchanged glances, unsure of what to expect. One journalist began typing the headline, "Youth Activist Responds to Trump," but hesitated. There was something in her walk that made the word responds feel too small. On the front row, the Secretary General shifted forward in his seat. Not a word had been spoken, and yet the room had already begun to lean toward her, as if magnetized by the silence. And in that silence, Ibrahim could feel it all. Not just the weight of what she was about to say, but the ghosts who walked with her. The women who had braided her hair by firelight while whispering stories of resistance. The farmers who'd been displaced by foreign mining companies with flags she didn't recognize. The children who learned to read using pages torn from Bibles and outdated political manifestos. She was not walking alone. Every step toward that microphone was a remembering, a reclamation of voices drowned out by louder rooms. She arrived at the podium and paused. She didn't adjust the mic. She didn't clear her throat. She simply let the silence settle around her like a cloak. The hall, moments ago brimming with commentary and political digestion, was now utterly still. She placed both hands lightly on the podium, her fingers relaxed. The same hands that had once clutched a protest sign outside a UN checkpoint. The same hands that had cleaned wounds during an outbreak. The same hands that had once gripped bars in a cell too small for standing. And now those hands rested with quiet certainty as she lifted her eyes and met the gaze of hundreds, diplomats, lawmakers, critics, allies, and strangers. She had no script, but she had truth. And in a room full of legacy, that was something no one else had dared carry bare. For a moment, Ibrahim said nothing. She allowed the silence to settle, not as a pause for effect, but as a form of respect. She looked slowly across the vast chamber, her gaze not scanning for approval, but simply acknowledging presence. The lights dimmed slightly to adjust for the new speaker, the camera lenses recalibrated. In a summit built on controlled language and rehearsed civility, something raw had entered the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was neither loud nor trembling. It was steady, low, and deliberate, a voice that had been shaped more by whispered defiance than public speaking engagements. "I would like to begin," she said, her accent soft but firm, "by honoring the privilege of standing here today. I do not take it lightly. My presence in this hall is not only my own." She paused. A few in the audience tilted forward, drawn not by dramatics, but by the way she commanded stillness, as if the silence around her had purpose. "I come from a village that no longer exists," she continued. "The maps call it an agricultural zone now. Others call it an investment corridor. I once called it home." Her words moved gently like water finding cracks in stone. Their children were not born into statistics but into dust. Not into schools but into waiting lines for food, for medicine, for rain that often never came. She looked directly ahead, not at anyone in particular, but with the kind of gaze that saw through the facades of rank and position. "We did not grow up angry. We grew up invisible." A hush rippled through the hall. Even those who had spent the last 30 minutes reveling in Trump's boldness now found themselves rooted to their seats, caught off guard by something they could neither applaud nor dismiss. "I come from a long line of people who were never quoted in your books, whose languages were never taught in your universities, whose pain was never included in your statistics." She lifted her chin slightly. "And yet we have lived. We have loved. We have resisted." There was no bitterness in her tone, only clarity, a kind of piercing honesty that made flattery impossible and defensiveness useless. She was not accusing, she was revealing. "In your history books," she said, "we are the footnotes, the passive voice. Villages were relocated, resources were extracted, borders were drawn, but who drew them, who profited, who paid?" A murmur began in one corner of the hall, quickly silenced by a sideways glance from a minister who sensed the moment's weight. "I have no illusions about this stage," she said. "I know that speeches can be applauded and then forgotten. I know that justice is often postponed to the next summit, the next study, the next century. But I am here because silence for people like me has always been the most expensive currency." Her hands remained calmly on the podium. She did not gesticulate wildly. She did not shout. She simply spoke as if the truth deserved its own oxygen. "I know there are those here who believe legacy is measured in flags raised or walls built. But where I come from, legacy is measured in what remains after the extraction ends, after the soldiers leave, after the cameras go home." She stopped there, letting the words hang. No one clapped. Not yet. It wasn't the kind of speech that invited interruption. It was the kind that forced recalibration of comfort, of pride, of the idea that the world had moved on from its ugliest chapters. And even as the summit staff fidgeted nervously, glancing at their timers, the room itself had changed. It no longer belonged to diplomats or delegates or donors. It belonged to her. She stopped speaking, not in defeat, not from hesitation, but with purpose, the kind of pause that rearranges attention, that makes even the habitual multitaskers in the back rows look up from their screens. She stood there still as stone, letting the air settle around her words like dust over a battlefield. The silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like anticipation. Then slowly she turned her head not toward the audience this time, but toward the camera, the one trained directly on her, the one feeding live footage to millions of screens around the world. Her eyes locked on the lens. She wasn't speaking to the diplomats anymore. She was speaking beyond them. She held that gaze for a breath, then another, and then she said low and clear, 3 words. She let them hang. A heartbeat passed. Another. "Where's the justice?" Not shouted, not performed, delivered. Each syllable carved with quiet fury, with weariness, with centuries that had never received reply. The impact wasn't immediate, not because it wasn't powerful, but because it had to be processed. Like a slow quake beneath the foundation of a building, the room didn't shake right away. It settled first, tensed, and then it broke. Somewhere near the front, a pen slipped from someone's fingers and hit the floor with an audible click. In the back row, a delegate from India slowly lowered his glasses. A translator in booth 6 stopped mid-sentence, hand frozen above the keyboard. The cameraman in charge of the broadcast feed whispered Jesus under his breath. She didn't elaborate. She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't need to. She let the question remain uncomfortably open, a mirror turned outward, catching the eyes of those who had made careers out of justifying discomfort, of balancing atrocities with language like policy and strategy. The question wasn't directed at one person. It belonged to everyone. The presidents who'd shaken hands with warlords, the corporations who mined wealth from dying earth, the governments who'd written checks with one hand while dropping bombs with the other, the influencers, the economists, the philanthropists, everyone who had sat at a table called progress while others were left scraping for breath. She looked back at the crowd now. No smile, no drama, just truth. "Where's the justice?" she repeated softer this time, as if addressing a child who'd asked why the food had run out again. It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't poetic. It was a demand. A needle plunged into the heart of global comfort. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was stunned. 3 seconds passed, then 5, then 10. No one moved. Because deep down, whether they wanted to admit it or not, they knew. They knew the answer, and that they were part of it. The silence had not yet lifted when the screens behind her flickered. It began subtly, almost as though the Summit tech team had cued the wrong feed. A quiet crackle of pixels, a shift in color. Then the Summit's official blue and white emblem disappeared entirely, replaced by a grainy overhead shot of a scorched village, rooftops collapsed like lungs that had exhaled their last breath. No sound accompanied it, just image. Then another, a child standing at the edge of a barbed wire fence, fingers clutching metal that had bitten into thousands before her. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and far too old for her size. Another image cut in a drone's eye view of a desert turned to ash, a line of human figures, barely visible, their shadows trailing like broken flags. No captions, no locations, only consequence. And still Ibrahim did not move. She didn't need to gesture or explain. The images said what language could not. Then came her voice, not projected from the podium, but through the chamber's speakers, clear and unshaken. She hadn't moved her lips yet. Her words now overlaid the visual stream with chilling synchronicity. You speak of greatness. The screen showed a convoy of tanks rolling through a war-torn street, children hiding in alleys as smoke choked the morning sun. I speak of consequences. The next image, a refugee camp on the border of nowhere, rows of tents pressed together like stacked sorrow. Wind lifted dust into the air. A girl chased a flying plastic bag as if it were a balloon. A collective breath held. No one had given these commands. The tech booth hadn't received instruction, but someone had prepared this. Maybe it was Ibrahim's team. Maybe it was her alone. Or maybe, as it seemed to those watching, the truth had simply overridden protocol. Greatness, her voice continued, measured in GDPs in fortified borders, while mothers die giving birth in hallways that haven't seen electricity in weeks. Greatness, she said again, defined by who gets to build the wall, not by who is buried beneath it. A new image now, a dark oil slick choking the coastline of a West African fishing village, men waist-deep in poisoned waters, holding nets full of plastic and nothing else. Some in the audience shifted. A few lowered their eyes. Others stared entranced and disturbed, as if witnessing something sacred and brutal all at once. In one row, a diplomat from France clenched his jaw. In another, a Brazilian delegate wiped her eye with the edge of her sleeve but kept watching. I am not here to insult your institutions, Ibrahim's voice said. I am here to ask what they are protecting. The images kept rolling. Protesters beaten in Chile, flooded towns in Bangladesh, a row of brown coffins in a Mediterranean port, a barefoot boy holding a shattered phone beside a crater where his school once stood. You claim order, she said, voice calm but sharpened now. But what kind of order demands silence to sustain itself? Still no music, no transitions, just footage like a courtroom slideshow with no cross-examination. She finally looked over her shoulder at the wall of flickering tragedy behind her. Then she turned back to the crowd. I don't need to tell you what's wrong, she said aloud now. You already know. You've known. You've managed it, budgeted it, endorsed it, then renamed it. No one applauded. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, the stage at the Palais des Nations felt like a place where truth had not just visited, but refused to leave quietly. The screens went black, but the silence stayed. Backstage in a secured lounge just off the main corridor, Donald Trump was pacing. His tie was slightly loosened, and though his expression remained mostly unreadable, there was a tightness in his movements, a visible shift from confident swagger to something closer to agitation. The words were still ringing in his ears. Where's the justice? He had heard them not through the speakers, but through the reaction, the kind of stillness in a crowd that signaled a rupture. Something had shifted in the room. The applause that had accompanied his departure only minutes ago now felt strangely distant, muted, as though something larger had swallowed it whole. He turned to one of his aides. What is she doing? He asked, voice low, tight. This wasn't on the schedule. What are these images? Who let that run? The aide stammered. Sir, I believe it was uploaded through the secondary AV system we didn't authorize. I don't care about your systems, Trump snapped. I care about controlling the damn message. On screen in the lounge, Ibrahim stood with her back to the blackened video wall, the room still gripped by her silence. Trump stared at her image. She didn't look like an enemy. She didn't even look like she was trying to win. That's what unnerved him. She wasn't fighting for dominance, she was just telling the truth, and people were listening. And that to him was far more dangerous. I'm going back out, he muttered. Sir, that's not advised, the chief of security interjected. We haven't cleared she's using my name, my legacy. I'm not going to sit here and let that happen. Trump straightened his jacket, tightened his tie, and without waiting for further permission, walked toward the edge of the backstage corridor that opened onto the main hall. Inside the chamber, Ibrahim had stepped slightly away from the podium. She was no longer delivering a speech. She was speaking as herself, as the child who had once stared at a dried-up well, as the young girl who'd buried her uncle beneath a tree that would soon be swallowed by a corporate mine. And then mid-sentence, she noticed the movement. A stir at stage left. Cameras shifted. Whispers buzzed. A presence large enough to split the air had entered once again. Trump stepped onto the edge of the stage. The audience turned sharply, unsure what was happening. This wasn't scheduled. This wasn't approved. But then again, neither was truth. He didn't speak at first. He just stood there, face set, waiting to be addressed, as if his reappearance alone was enough to redirect the spotlight. Ibrahim met his gaze, calm, steady. She did not flinch. She did not move away. Instead, she walked toward him. Not hurriedly, not defensively, just forward. Two figures now on one stage, one built from towers, headlines, decades of noise. The other built from dust, silence, and survival. She stopped just short of him, close enough that the microphone still caught her voice low, but unmistakably clear. "Where's the justice, Mr. Trump?" She let the words land. He blinked. She continued, tone never rising, only sharpening. "For the children born beneath the drones, your policies armed. For the mothers locked in cages at borders built in your name. For the rivers poisoned by deals signed with the stroke of your pen." He opened his mouth, closed it. The crowd waited. "Where's the justice?" she said again, this time, with the weariness of someone who had asked it too many times already. "For those not born under your flag." Trump shifted slightly, squaring his shoulders. "I brought peace. I brought prosperity. You brought silence," she interrupted, "to those who couldn't afford it." The chamber fell so quiet that even the cameras dared not zoom. For the first time in the summit's history, two worlds, the architect of power and its consequence, stood side by side, not in debate, but in reckoning. Trump looked around as if expecting applause. There was none. Ibrahim held his gaze one more second, then turned slowly, walking back toward the center of the stage. She didn't dismiss him. She simply moved beyond him. She hadn't come to fight a man. She had come to confront a system, and now the system had a face. For a beat, the stage hung in an unnatural stillness. Trump frozen, mid-step, Ibrahim, already walking away, the air between them, vibrating with unsaid words. Then in a movement both instinctive and strategic, two summit security officers stepped in from the wings, blocking Trump's path to the center. "Sir," one of them said carefully, not touching him, but asserting enough presence to make the point. "We need you to exit." He hesitated, visibly fuming, caught somewhere between disbelief and calculation. He had never been told no on a stage like this, never redirected in front of camera that once hung on his every word. The murmurs in the audience grew louder, the tension now crackling into motion. And then from somewhere near the middle row came a single crisp clap. Then another, and another. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't even enthusiastic at first. It was cautious, uncertain. But it spread. Like sparks finding dry kindling, the applause began to grow, swelling from rows of silent observers who had moments ago been too stunned to move. Now something had broken loose. Something unspoken had been named. Applause filled the chamber, not wild, not chaotic, but powerful. Applause not for spectacle, but for truth. Trump looked out over the crowd, his eyes darting from face to face. There were still supporters, yes, but even they seemed unsure whether to stand or sit, whether to clap or remain still. The rules had changed and they were no longer his. Backstage aides scrambled to control the press feed, but the live stream had already been mirrored by independent broadcasters. Clips were being trimmed, subtitled, captioned, and shared by the second. On social media, a phrase emerged almost instantly, not crafted by a marketing team, not branded in advance, but born from three unscripted words: "Shashpursa the Justice." By the time Ibrahim stepped down from the stage, the hashtag had begun trending in Berlin, Lagos, and São Paulo. Within 20 minutes, it was the #1 global trend across every major platform. News networks abandoned their pre-scheduled commentary segments to rerun the last 90 seconds of her speech. Commentators struggled to keep up. Phones buzzed in the pockets of diplomats still seated in the chamber, their faces blank as their screens lit up with headlines they hadn't seen coming. 3 words that shook Geneva. 72 seconds. That redefined legacy. Trump overshadowed by truth. The phrase 72-second speech was born from a journalist's live tweet, noting the timestamp from Ibrahim's first word to her final question. The clip would be replayed across continents, taught in classrooms, dissected by political theorists, and sampled in protest songs within days. Inside the chamber, Trump turned sharply, his face, hard jaw clenched. He didn't storm off, not quite, but he left with quick steps and no words, disappearing backstage where cameras no longer followed. Ibrahim didn't watch him leave. She didn't need to. She had said what needed saying, and the world had heard her. No podium would erase it. No spin could bury it. In just 72 seconds, a new legacy had taken root, not carved in stone, but etched into conscience. And somewhere far from Geneva, a girl watching on a borrowed screen whispered the words to herself as if committing them to memory. Where's the justice? By the time Ibrahim Traoré's plane left Geneva's airspace later that night, the world beneath her had already changed. Newsrooms across continents had torn up their evening scripts. Editors barked into headsets. Hosts stared into cameras with a mix of awe and uncertainty, trying to shape language around an event that didn't fit the usual frames of politics or performance. A confrontation or a confession, asked one commentator on BBC. A national embarrassment, claimed a U.S. cable pundit, his tone indignant. The moment history blinked, said a South African journalist's voice, low with reverence. The networks were split. Some called her reckless, disrespectful, unpatriotic, one anchor snarled. Uninvited, another emphasized. But others called her brave, unshakable, necessary. Even those who disagreed with her tone found themselves repeating her words. Where's the justice, like a phrase they couldn't quite stop turning over in their minds. Within 12 hours, over 90 million people had watched the clip. By the next morning, it had been translated into 34 languages, subtitled in real time by volunteers, shared in encrypted group chats, and high school classrooms, projected onto buildings in downtown São Paulo and Nairobi. Ibrahim's voice, calm, unbending, now lived on 1,000 timelines. World leaders scrambled to position themselves. Some issued formal statements. A few congratulated her by name, thinly veiled attempts to ride the momentum. Others distanced themselves quickly, dismissing her comments as oversimplified or emotionally charged. But behind closed doors, staffers were instructed to assess potential fallout. Policy advisors fielded questions they hadn't anticipated. What are we doing in the Sahel? When was our last audit of border detention facilities? Have we reviewed the child mortality reports in Yemen? Ibrahim hadn't just told a story. She had shifted the conversation forcefully, unapologetically, and irrevocably. Meanwhile, on the streets, the impact took on new forms. In Minneapolis, a group of high school students organized a walkout, holding cardboard signs that read, "Where's the justice in Cape Town?" A muralist painted Ibrahim's face on a crumbling city wall, her features half in shadow, half in sunrise. In Berlin, protesters projected her speech onto the side of the Bundestag in glowing white letters, line by line, as crowds stood in stillness. In Paris, a street violinist stood outside the U.S. Embassy playing a slowed, haunting, instrumental version of her speech, remixed with ambient soundscapes and protest vocals. The video went viral within hours. Even pop culture responded. A Grammy-winning producer tweeted, "Sampling Ibrahim's speech. Don't care if it gets banned. This belongs to the world now." Within days, remixes appeared on TikTok, scored by violins and African drums. A minimalist spoken-word version climbed Spotify's global viral chart. Ibrahim's words had become not just political, they had become cultural. And yet, for all the noise, all the praise and analysis, there was something quieter taking root. A reckoning. In small offices and town halls and refugee shelters and legal clinics, people began asking questions that couldn't be deferred anymore. The speech had reopened wounds but also cracked open locked doors. In one panel discussion, a young journalist summed it up with unexpected clarity. It wasn't just what she said, it's that no one stopped her. Not security, not power, not fear. That silence, that was the shift. From Geneva to Johannesburg, Detroit to Dhaka, a tremor had moved through the foundations of diplomacy and public discourse, a reminder that legacy is not just inherited, but interrogated. And while Trump's team scrambled to regain control of the narrative, the world for just a moment wasn't listening to them. It was listening to her. The morning after the summit, Ibrahim's name was spoken in the U.S. Senate chamber, not in admiration, but in outrage. She insulted a former president on a global stage, barked one senator from Florida. She disrespected American values. She should never be allowed to speak on U.S. soil again. Others followed. Conservative news outlets ran round-the-clock segments analyzing her posture, her scarf, her citizenship, even her tone. Talk radio flooded with callers demanding apologies, sanctions, even investigation. One commentator, red-faced and incredulous, referred to her as a mouthpiece for anarchists in a head wrap. But the backlash wasn't just words. It came in the form of anonymous threats, digital bile funneled into her inbox by the thousands. Death threats, slurs, doctored images. Her phone buzzed constantly, an avalanche of anger, with no return address. Her name trended again, this time not with admiration, but as the epicenter of a cultural fault line. Yet amid the firestorm, something else rose, quiet at first, then undeniable. Letters, emails, voicemails from payphones in countries where Wi-Fi was still a luxury. At first, her team filtered them, screening for danger, shielding her from the flood. But Ibrahim asked to see them, not just the messages from leaders and press agencies, but everything. One afternoon, she closed the door to her small apartment in Geneva, drew the curtains against the flashing cameras outside, and sat on the floor with the letters spread around her like fallen leaves. A boy named Elias from Gaza had written in careful English, "You said what my father couldn't say before he died. Thank you." A grandmother from Chicago, 82 years old, sent a handwritten note, "I marched in 1963. I thought no one remembered what justice should sound like. You reminded me." A teenage girl from the outskirts of Nairobi wrote in Swahili. Ibrahim translated it silently, word by word. It read, "You didn't speak for us. You let us speak through you." Thousands of them, some simple, some poetic, some scrawled in pencil, others typed in sterile fonts. Many didn't even contain full sentences, just to name a country and the phrase "thank you." She picked up a voice message left by a refugee camp volunteer in Lesbos. "They've printed your quote on a tarp. The kids read it before school. The adults whisper it when they stand in food lines. It's not just a slogan, it's a question that keeps us standing upright." The weight was enormous, but it didn't crush her. It grounded her, because now the moment wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every village that had been erased from maps, every protest that hadn't been televised, every mother who'd asked the same question through tears no one recorded. She lit a candle on her desk. The room was quiet. No speeches, no lights. Just her and the rising tide of voices that had once been drowned out, now returned to her in thousands of envelopes folded with care. She closed her eyes and breathed. This wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. But beginnings, she knew, are where fires start. That night, her team forwarded dozens of speaking invitations. Harvard, the UN General Assembly, 3 European parliaments, a documentary crew in Canada, a Nobel laureate offered to collaborate on a public statement. But she didn't answer them. Not yet. Instead, she sat by the window, watching a slow rain trace lines down the glass. In her hand was a final letter, no return address. Inside, one sentence, "Your voice is what justice sounds like when it finally stops asking for permission." She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in her coat pocket, just in case she ever forgot. It took less than 48 hours for Donald Trump to reappear, not behind a podium this time, but on television screens across America, flanked by flags and flattery. The first interview aired on a friendly network seated in a faux library set all mahogany shelves and warm lighting. The host nodded before Trump even finished sentences, the atmosphere more revival than journalism. "She's angry," he said, voice measured but tinged with indignation. Very angry young woman. Disrespectful. Clearly didn't understand the honor of being on that stage. He leaned forward, hands clasped. "I've built peace deals. I've protected jobs. I've defended America from global chaos." And she insults all of it with 3 rehearsed words. He shook his head. "Ungrateful," the host murmured in agreement. Over the next 3 days, he repeated the performance across multiple platforms. Press releases framed Ibrahim's speech as a calculated hit job, a display of radical hostility, and even an imported act of stage propaganda. One aide called it an emotional stunt, suggesting she had been manipulated by far-left handlers. But something was different this time. The words didn't land the way they once did. They echoed, but they didn't resonate. Social media users posted side-by-side clips, Trump's rambling interviews, cut against Ibrahim's 72-second speech. One account simply captioned it, "Noise versus clarity." The more he spoke, the more rehearsed he sounded. Like a man reading from an old script in a play the world had stopped watching. And for the first time in years, the world didn't rally to his defense, not in the same numbers, not with the same fervor. There were loyalists, yes. There were echo chambers as always. But the headlines didn't obey him. The narrative had already shifted. What was once a microphone now felt like a megaphone pointed at an empty room. In the days that followed, analysts tried to explain the shift. He's relying on an old playbook, said one political strategist. But the rules have changed. She didn't attack him. She didn't even name him. She questioned something larger, and people felt that. Some said he missed the moment entirely. Others said he'd never seen it coming. Ibrahim, for her part, said nothing. No counterstatements, no rebuttals, no appearances. Just silence, a silence that to many now spoke louder than all his noise combined. A late-night host summarized it best during his monologue. Trump gave interviews. Ibrahim gave a question. And somehow the world decided it was time to answer her instead. In Washington, his advisors met behind closed doors to reassess strategy. Poll numbers wobbled. Donor calls grew tense. One consultant admitted off the record he brought volume. She brought gravity. There's no talking over that. For the first time in years, Trump wasn't the most viral voice in the room. The spotlight hadn't dimmed, it had simply moved, and it wasn't coming back. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. But exhaustion, like grief, is not always announced. It crept in quietly somewhere between reading the last of the day's messages and folding the letter from the grandmother in Chicago. The flicker of candlelight had cast soft shadows across the room, and her breathing had grown shallow, steady. Then, without warning, her dreams opened like floodgates, and the fire returned. She was 6 again. The sky was red, not from sunset, but from burning roofs. Thatched walls crumbled into ash as soldiers marched through the village boots, crunching over memory and mortar. Screams stitched the night air together like a song of mourning. Goats ran wild, and her cousin had dropped a bowl of water, its clay shattered on the dirt, mixing mud with terror. She remembered the smell, first smoke and sweat, and something else. Fear. That strange scent that sits just beneath the skin when people realize they might not survive the night. Her mother had grabbed her by the wrist, yanking her into the low brush behind their hut, crouching low. Ibrahim had tried to cry, but her mother covered her mouth with calloused fingers, whispering against her ear with a voice calm and furious at once. "Do not make a sound. Not now. You survive this. Then you speak." The soldiers were shouting in French words she didn't understand yet, but would come to learn meant orders, weapons power. One of them kicked in a door 3 huts down. The neighbor's dog howled once, then went silent. Ibrahim had shut her eyes, but the fire was brighter than darkness. Later that night, when the village lay smoldering and the soldiers had disappeared into the hills, her mother gathered what little remained into a torn sack, a spoon, a photograph, a pair of sandals, a single jar of cassava paste. They didn't bury the dead. They walked away from them. She remembered the silence afterward. How strange it was, like a world holding its breath after a scream. Her mother never cried, at least not where Ibrahim could see. Instead, she built routine from wreckage boil, water grind, maize keep moving. But every night before sleep, she would take Ibrahim's small face into her hands and whisper the same words like a prayer passed down through centuries. Speak the truth, even if your voice shakes. And for years, her voice did shake. The first time she stood in front of her schoolmates to denounce a teacher who hoarded supplies, her hands trembled so violently that her chalk snapped in two. When she was 15 and stood before a gathering of elders to demand answers about a land deal that displaced her aunt, she could barely keep her balance. Her knees quivered, her throat dried out, but she spoke anyway. Each time the shaking lessened. Not because the fear disappeared, but because the truth became heavier than the fear itself. Now, years later, in the dim quiet of her room, Ibrahim stirred in her sleep, lips parting slightly, as if mouthing something just beyond consciousness. Her hands resting on her chest curled softly into fists. And when she awoke, she didn't gasp or cry out. She just breathed slowly, evenly, carrying the flame forward like her mother had asked her to. Long before anyone called her an activist, Ibrahim was simply a girl who asked too many questions. She asked them under trees after lessons had ended, when she would gather younger children and rewrite the day's lessons in chalk and sand, translating official school content into local dialects. Many of the girls in her village didn't have books, so she drew the letters with her finger in the dust again and again until memory replaced paper. She asked questions in the market too. Why did the grain seller raise prices on the widows? Why were the cleanest water barrels reserved for the men who worked for the foreign road crews? Why were the best school uniforms always handed out to the boys, even when the girls had better marks? There were no satisfying answers, so she started keeping count. She scribbled names, dates, numbers, how many children missed class because they were sick from unclean water, how many babies died without midwives, how many hours women walked each week just to grind millet at the one functioning machine which belonged to a minister's cousin. At 13, she began organizing. She brought together a dozen girls and told them they would take turns walking to the mill, no longer accepting last place in the line. She asked the schoolmaster to let the older girls stay an hour after class to teach the younger ones. When he refused, she taught them herself under the mango tree behind the clay fence. By 15, she was attending community meetings meant only for men. She didn't speak at first, just sat in the back, arms folded, eyes sharp. Then one evening, when the district officer dismissed a mother's plea for food relief as emotional exaggeration, Ibrahim stood up, and she listed the names of the dead, quietly, in order, one by one. That night she wasn't invited back, but the women remembered. Her arrest came 2 years later. She had helped coordinate a peaceful protest, dozens of women and children standing in front of the regional governor's compound, holding signs painted in charcoal and dye. The message was simple: our land, our voice. The police arrived before midday. She was taken quietly without fanfare. No cameras, no trial. 4 days in a concrete holding room with no window, one cracked bucket, and a ceiling that leaked at dawn. Her interrogator asked her who was funding her. She said, "My conviction." When they released her, they told her to be quiet. That was their first mistake. Their second was letting her go. Because exile, it turned out, did not silence her. It widened her reach. Through a grant arranged by a sympathetic NGO, she was sent to Dakar, then Paris. There she entered a world of libraries, forums, lectures, and bureaucratic distance from the suffering she knew intimately. She spoke sparingly at first. Academia had its own language, and her accent betrayed her origin before she could even finish her first sentence. But when she did speak, in small student circles, in late-night radio debates, in rooms filled with people who thought poverty was just a statistic, the room always went still. Not because she was loud, but because she was undeniable. She learned to navigate the spaces between radical truth and palatable delivery. She became fluent in policy, economics, environmental law, but she never let them sand the edges off her voice. And slowly, inevitably, people began to listen. She was invited to panels, then plenaries, then summits. They called her bold, brilliant, a bridge between worlds. She never called herself anything, but in quiet moments when no one else was watching, she would close her eyes and repeat the words her mother once whispered through fire and smoke. "Speak the truth, even if your voice shakes." And so she did. The lake was quiet. A thin mist hovered just above the water's surface, softening the horizon where sky met earth. The stillness was not eerie but sacred, like the air itself had agreed to remain silent just for her. Ibrahim sat alone on a smooth, flat rock at the lake's edge, wrapped in a shawl, her knees drawn slightly toward her chest. Her shoes sat beside her in the dew-damp grass, forgotten. She wasn't here to be seen. No cameras, no microphones, no questions. Just wind-still water and the faint rustling of reeds. It had been 4 days since the summit. 4 days since she had spoken the words that echoed into history. 4 days since the noise began. Endless emails, invitations, accusations. Interviews she declined. Tributes she couldn't process. Threats she chose not to read. News anchors continued debating her like she was a theory, not a person. Supporters wrote sonnets in her name. Critics demanded consequences. In all of it, her voice had somehow become everyone else's property. But here at the lake, she belonged to herself again. Her phone was turned off. Her coat lay folded beside her. The sky reflected off the water like a half-finished memory. And for once, she wasn't thinking. She wasn't strategizing. She was just being not a symbol, not a spokesperson, just a woman trying to exhale. She watched a dragonfly hover over the reeds. She followed the ripples of a distant duck paddling into fog. Time moved differently here, slowly, generously. She hadn't realized how little silence she'd had in her life until she returned to it. Then somewhere behind her the light crunch of footsteps. Small, cautious. Not paparazzi. She turned her head slightly and saw a little girl no older than 8 standing at the edge of the path, watching her with wide, unsure eyes. The child wore a worn red jacket, a school backpack slung too low on her shoulders. Her braids were loose at the ends. She took one tentative step forward, then paused. Ibrahim gave a soft smile and said nothing. The girl hesitated, then walked closer slowly, deliberately, until she stood just beside the stone. Her voice, when it came, was no louder than the wind. "Thank you," that was all. She didn't elaborate. She didn't ask for a selfie or explain who she was. She just said it with the kind of reverence that only children can deliver, direct, pure, and with more truth than volume. Ibrahim looked at her, truly looked, and in that gaze saw something more potent than all the broadcasts and protests and speeches that followed her words. She saw recognition, and in that moment, for the first time since she stepped off the stage, something inside her softened, loosened, released. Tears came quietly, unexpectedly, not from sorrow, not from exhaustion, but from relief, from knowing that what she carried had landed somewhere that mattered, that all the weight, all the fear, all the cost had found its meaning in one small voice echoing hers. The girl stood with her a while longer, then turned and walked back down the path. Ibrahim remained still, and the lake, for all its stillness, reflected back someone both older and lighter than before. Months passed, but Ibrahim's words did not fade. In lecture halls from Oxford to Nairobi, professors quoted her now famous speech. Political science students studied the 72-second moment like it was a case study in moral clarity. Her question, "Where's the justice?" appeared in law journals, ethics seminars, and was painted across classroom whiteboards alongside Gandhi and King. In justice departments across Europe and parts of Latin America, civil servants cited her words during policy reviews, especially in matters of immigration reparations and environmental law. Her phrase had become not only a challenge, but a measure of accountability. The streets reflected it too. In São Paulo, a muralist painted her silhouette across an entire city block, arms wide, with "Where's the justice?" written in over a dozen languages. In South Korea, it was seen stenciled in subway tunnels. In Brooklyn, it became the slogan of a grassroots mayoral campaign. Publishers began titling books after it. Protesters wove it into songs. Even corporate brands awkwardly tried to echo it, not realizing the weight behind the words could not be commodified. Still, Ibrahim stayed quiet. She appeared sparingly. She let the world wrestle with her question on its own. And wrestle it did. When the White House invitation arrived, it came in the form of a hand-delivered envelope. It was formal, polished, and predictably vague. "You are cordially invited for a private dialogue with the President of the United States to discuss matters of mutual global concern." Her advisors urged her to consider it. Media pundits speculated endlessly. Some said it was a victory. Others warned it was a trap. Ibrahim didn't waver. She declined, not with arrogance, but with purpose. Instead, she boarded a small humanitarian flight bound for a refugee camp on the southern edge of Tunisia. A place rarely named in headlines, but where stories like her own live quietly in tense and long waiting lines. She didn't arrive with press. She didn't carry a security detail, just notebooks, a pen, and a voice. That afternoon, under the canvas shade of a makeshift awning, she sat surrounded by over 100 displaced people, women, men, children, and listened. Really listened. Then she stood and addressed them, her voice soft but sure. "They offered me a podium," she said, "but I don't need podiums. I need people. I came here because justice does not live in marble halls. It lives in the stories we are afraid to tell." She asked nothing from them, but they gave her everything: their silence, their truths, their trust. And as she walked back to her cot that night, dusty shoes and aching feet, she felt more powerful than she had ever felt in any conference room in Geneva. The final scene unfolds in a quiet village, dry heat, red soil, children's laughter ringing in the air. Ibrahim walks along a path lined with trees toward a simple school made of cement and corrugated metal. Her scarf is faded now, her steps a little slower, but her presence is unmistakable. Inside the school, a group of children are gathered barefoot, curious, hopeful. One stands and begins to speak. "Where's the justice?" he asks, not with anger, but with courage. Another joins, then another. Soon they are chanting gently, joyfully, "Where's the justice? Where's the justice?" They aren't demanding vengeance. They're demanding visibility. And with each voice added, the phrase no longer sounds like a cry of protest. It sounds like a promise. From behind the classroom door, the narrator's voice enters, calm, reflective, full of quiet triumph. She spoke 3 words. The world listened, and history bent just slightly toward the truth. The screen fades to black, but the question lingers. Sometimes courage isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, and timed with purpose. Ibrahim Traoré didn't shout, threaten, or seek applause. She simply asked a question that echoed through power, privilege, and history. Where's the justice? In just 3 words, she reminded the world that truth doesn't need permission to be heard. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it. Have you ever witnessed a moment when truth silenced the noise and made people truly listen? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.